Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Ewan Mackey, who is a Professor of Law at King's College London and a Research Associate at the Centre for Business Research, University of Cambridge. He specialises in labour law and public services, including education, teaches anti-discrimination law, and is an author of several books on these topics. Ewan also has been a volunteer and advocate for free representation unit in complex discrimination actions, and a part of the world's oldest free speech society, his whole adult life. So, over to you.
Thank you very much for chairing, Amnon. Thank you to Ian for organising. Thank you to everyone in the audience for coming along on what I think is an absolutely crucial issue, which is the relationship between speech and what we in universities do to uphold, I think, the ideals of the Enlightenment. Free speech, along with freedom of association, is said to be the lifeblood of democracy because without freedom of speech, according to an old Cambridge VC called Ivor Jennings, the appeal to reason, which is the basis of democracy, cannot be made. And sometimes we have to speak what we feel, not, as Shakespeare said, what we ought to say, because free speech is also something that's relational, and that's particularly important in a democracy. It's not just about what I want to say, what I want to speak to you, but it's about engaging in a debate, part of public reason. And that's the lifeblood of democracy, because sometimes we can be persuaded. Sometimes we can find that when we have an interchange of ideas, we understand that we're wrong. So we have to passionately defend free speech and make sure that we have institutions that uphold it. As John Stuart Mill, the old Westminster MP, once said, even if somebody is wrong, the things that they say may contain an element of truth, so we shouldn't suppress what they say. And even if they're completely wrong, it makes sure when we have an interchange of ideas that we don't hold our own opinions in prejudice, we hold them because of conviction, because they're based in reason. So I think Evelyn Beatrice Hall was right when she said that we have to advance a culture where, paraphrasing Voltaire, I may disapprove of what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And, you know, in the way that we achieve this as a society, I think Albert Einstein was very instructive. He said that laws alone cannot secure freedom of expression. Laws alone cannot secure freedom of expression. There must be a spirit of tolerance in the entire population. He knew that well because he was ejected from the University of Berlin when the fascist dictatorship took power and government marched ever more and more into universities. So free speech requires continual defense. It has to be defended in every generation. And today, freedom of speech, freedom of expression is under threat, most of all from the crackdowns on protests because of big money in politics, particularly in America under the guise of free speech, drowning out everyone else's voices in the political process, the weaponization of social media, and the distortion of public reason through the spread of conspiracy theories, particularly through, online. And people are divided, more divided than they ever have been, particularly in America, but also in Britain. And that's so important for a democracy, because if we're divided, if we can't have conversations, we can't trust each other. And if we can't trust each other, then we can't engage in discourse to reach a consensus. So these towering intellectuals, along this line from Jennings and Shakespeare and Mill and Beatrice Hall and Einstein, we come to Gavin Williamson. Sir Gavin, of course, was the person who introduced the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023, the guy who kept a tarantula in his box when he was Tory whip, the guy who, as Education Secretary, said, I can't remember my A-level grades, I remember opening the envelope but not what they were, the guy who caused the A-level fiasco in 2020 that made all our student numbers go up. Hands up if you're an academic, by the way, just a show of hands. Okay, very good. So you know what I'm talking about. And with this record of impeccable service, Sir Gavin, of course, got a knighthood from Boris Johnson. And his act did two main things, as we've heard. It gave people a right to sue universities for, well, not upholding free speech, and it gave the power of the Office for Students, which costs 32 million a year. We didn't have it before, now we do. It gave it power to bring enforcement actions against universities and student unions, and gave us a free speech czar. I mean, it's great that it's called a czar, isn't it? You know, free speech, you want a czar. So, look, the positive argument that I want to make is we're all in favour of free speech, but I go further. I'd say that we've got to defend the values of the Enlightenment passionately, free inquiry without limit. And all those values are under attack precisely by what that last Conservative government did. And this is the bigger context of what they did. It's not just this little act. Massive funding cuts to universities, over 60% to research since 2010. Home student fees tripling, international student fees unlimited. None of this, of course, going into teaching, because your pay as an academic is down in real terms by 25% since 2010. The suppression of academic voice, the retraction of autonomy, our governing bodies mostly self-appointing, academics not having the power to elect the people in the governing bodies and making decisions over universities. So if we want to talk about threats to freedom of speech, we've got to focus on this and not be distracted by what is essentially a far-right agenda, far worse in America, you know, with the attacks on woke universities and the attacks on science, but still present in Britain, a little bit more polite, but still there. Michael Gove's attacks on the experts. Nigel Farage saying universities have a huge left-wing bias. And this act is part of the attack. These people are not on your side. These people who proposed the act do not want to make universities better. On the contrary, if we want to stand up for universities and what they do, we've got to do the things that the act is trying to distract you from. We've got to fund universities properly. We've got to make sure that academics have more autonomy. Most importantly, this is part of a delegitimization effort for universities. Of course, there are cases of people being cancelled, and those are wrong, but what is the way that we say it? The answer, the way that we solve it, the answer is not, and I want Aqua to be well paid and well remunerated as much as anyone, but the answer is not by letting the lawyers in and allowing litigation. It's a bonanza for lawyers. It doesn't solve the problems of these really hot-button issues like the trans versus gender-critical debates, like Israel and Palestine. The way that we solve these things is through reasoned, careful, democratic discourse. Things that are not promoted by Twitter, they're not promoted by angry email exchanges, and they're certainly not promoted, these problems aren't solved by going to court and letting the lawyers run riot. So I don't think that we should restore this act. On the contrary, what we need to be having is not a higher education, freedom of speech in that sort of Orwellian style of language act of 2023. We need a higher education democratic governance act to make sure that universities are functioning and academic freedom and freedom of speech is upheld. And perhaps I could just end on this point. Of course it's true that when people are cancelled, when people are disinvited, it's unhappy, perhaps for them. And some of the cases are genuinely, disappointing. But one person's freedom of expression is not taken away by another person exercising their freedom of expression in protest. One person's freedom of expression is not taken away by a student union or a group deciding to disinvite somebody because of a democratic decision exercising their right to freedom of association. So that's what is at the heart of this. And so I would commend you to support the idea that we should scrap this act and move on to a more positive way to make our universities better. Thank you.
Thank you very much.